welcome to another edition of Turned Out a Punk. I'm your host, Damian Abraham, and once again, I'm bringing you a conversation with someone who grew up listening to punk, may or may not still be involved with punk, but had their life changed by the genre in a major way. And today on the show, someone that changed my life in a major way through their music, Brian Ritchie from the band The Violent Femmes, also did solo stuff, and more on that in 1 second, but this is a huge one for me. But first, if you would like to get in touch with me, head over to the email address, turnedoutapunkpodcast@gmail.com. That is run by my brother and show producer and guest booker extraordinaire, Tristan Abraham, and he will get the message to me. Thank you, Tristan, for all the hard work you do for this show. I love you, buddy. You can also find me on Twitter and Instagram at Left4Damien. If you want to support the show, the best way to support the show is by telling all your friends about it, letting everyone know that you enjoy this podcast. We do a couple episodes a week, and we talk to people about punk. You can also support it by subscribing to it and rating it on iTunes, and thank you to everyone that does do that, or by heading over to patreon.com/turnedoutapunk and checking out some of the stuff that we put up over there. And huge thank you to people that do check that out and support on that thing as well. There's video episodes, there's lost episodes, there's footnotes, and all sorts of fun stuff. So you can find that over there at patreon.com/turnedoutapunk. And speaking of support, this show would not be possible without the kind, loving support of the fine folks at Vans, who came aboard a few years ago and said, Damien, do what you do, just don't do it out of your own pocket. And they've helped me cover the cost of this thing. And I can't thank them enough for doing that, because there are costs with this podcast. And guess what? The House of Vans is back October 30th in Chicago. There will be a House of Vans show. I don't think I will be attending. They haven't hit me up about attending, but there will be a House of Vans show back with the Melvins. So pretty big way to kick it off. So it's coming back. And speaking of coming back, the band I play in, Fucked Up, will be coming back to playing live shows at some point in 2022. We're going to be going on tour in support of our 10th anniversary of the album David Comes to Life. I think that makes sense. It's going to be reissued by Matador Records. You can find out more information about the reissue on their site, but you can find out more dates for this Fucked Up tour that we're doing. We're doing a lot of shows, going to a lot of places. Chances are we're probably going to where you live right now. Maybe not, but chances, there's a chance. There's a chance. So you can find out more information about those dates over at fuckedup.cc. And also, Fucked Up will be putting out Epics in Minutes, finally on vinyl, our first singles compilation. So if you thought we sucked after the first LP, you are in luck. The compilation of all the stuff prior to that is coming out on our friends at Get Better Records. You can pre-order that now. I think there's a few pre-orders left. I think it's almost gone. And get that in your hot little hands. And also you can get in your hot little hands Year of the Horse, Fucked Up's latest record, which is a hour-and-a-half long song. And our good buddy Scotty Karate will be putting that out on Tank Crimes. So you can find out more information over there at Tank Crimes website as well. All right, that is that. On to today's show. Today on the show, as I said off the top, someone who played a huge role in my musical development through his music, Brian Ritchie from the band The Violent Femmes, is here on the show. Now, there are some people out there that do not consider The Violent Femmes a punk band. I am not one of them, and I don't know who these people are. But hopefully, if you are one of these people, this interview will put that to rest, because to have Brian kind of contextualize them into the world of punk rock, that's why I do this thing. That is why I do this thing. Also, maybe we can get Violent Femmes to reissue Rock, which is one of my favorite EPs. But anyway, we talk more about that in the show. You'll hear that in a second. Before I let you listen to it, though, I need to inform you that the Violent Femmes have reissued for the 30th anniversary Why Do Birds Sing. It just came out, I think this past week, actually. So you can pick that up on vinyl. It's remastered. There's bonus tracks and all sorts of fun stuff on that thing. I think that record's amazing. Like, they are a band. All their records I find interesting and fun to listen to. But the record that they put out that's probably most important to me, because of where it led me, you'll hear about this on the show as well, is the greatest hits package added up, which I know picking a greatest hits record is a cop-out, but I think this record just stands up as a complete sort of reflection of how sonically diverse this band is. Anyway, that has also been reissued on vinyl for the first time, and so you can pick that up as well. I gotta get that on vinyl. I don't have that on vinyl. I just have my old CD. Anyway, while I go out to the store and grab that on record, sit back, relax, and enjoy Brian Ritchie on Turned Out a Punk. Brian, thank you so much for coming on the show.
How you doing, Damien?
Well, I'm very excited to talk to you. As I was just telling you off air, years ago when I first got into, I don't know, punk music for a broad term, alternative music, whatever, interesting music, I should say. I went to a CD store in Calgary and I bought Violent Femmes Added Up, and I bought Circle Jerk's double album with Group Sex and Wild in the Streets, and that was my gateway to the rest of my life. So I owe you a debt and a huge thank you off the top.
Well, we owe you and everyone else like you for giving us a reason to exist.
Well, I appreciate that, and we'll see if you are still appreciating me at the end of this interview. But we got to start this off the way they all start, which is, Brian, how did you get into punk? Do you remember the first time you ever came across the genre?
Well, that's kind of a difficult question because it also makes you have to define what punk is. But I mean, I was already listening to some music which now in retrospect I would consider punk, such as Iggy and the Stooges, Patti Smith. I was very much into Patti Smith when she came out, and some other bands that kind of predated punk a little bit, like Television. Mm-hmm. Although some people think that is punk. So,
I think on this show we consider it all punk. We definitely, I think Stooges, like you said, that's a punk band.
Yeah. So I think really, okay, so there's the historic listening to music. Like, for example, I was really into the Kinks. I was really into the Beatles, Stones, Hendrix, but that wasn't my generation. So the first generation appropriate artist that was also punk that I really got into was Patti Smith. And since she was in the New York scene and she was associated with Tom Verlaine, that led me to Television, which is still my favorite band. And that, of course, that led to Richard Hell and the Voidoids. But we were also into the New York Dolls. I mean, I don't know if that predates, the punk explosion, but
that's what I think is so fascinating about it, is because it's almost like a coalescing of all this sort of energy that's happening all over the world. Like in Australia, you have Radio Birdman and the Saints going prior to any of the stuff coming out being called punk. You have Dr. Feelgood in England doing it. You've got, it felt like there was sort of this energy, like you said, the Kinks and the Rolling Stones is sort of like hearkening back to whatever strain of rock and roll that was, and sort of this sort of like energy that was sort of coming together throughout the 70s, it feels like.
Well, yeah, and I was already into stuff like, for example, the Blues Magoos, Count Five, the Seeds, and the Seeds were extremely punky. Mm-hmm. So anyway, I was already prepared for it, but then when the big explosion happened in 1976, 77, I was right there with Clash, Sex Pistols, Wire, the Jam, which some people probably see as a pop band, but I saw them as a punk band, because to me they dressed differently, but they sang the same way the Clash sang, and it sounded like punk to me. And Wire is still a great band, still one of my favorite bands. Devo, and then there were Jonathan Richman and the Modern Lovers, or the Modern Lovers, if you want to just say the Modern Lovers. In fact, I had lunch today with Jerry and Ernie.
That's awesome.
Yeah. We go back a long way, and we were talking about the Modern Lovers, and it's an interesting. I mean, they were doing punk way before it was called punk.
Mm-hmm.
I think if they had not split up, and if Jonathan had not like abandoned that musical concept prematurely, they would have gotten a lot more credit than
Oh yeah.
they have.
Yeah, it's amazing to think of where they would have gone sonically too, because that record is just, and it's basically just a collection of, recordings more than it is even as an album. But it's just like it stands up. It's still ahead of its time today.
It's still current. Like I was riding around in my car with my son, and he's a music fan, and he knows a lot about music. Obviously, he's my son. So, but on the radio came the Modern Lovers, and I said, "So, what do you think of this band?" And without telling him what it was, "Oh, they're great." I said, "So, when do you think this album was made?" "Well, sounds like it's current." And I said, "Well, actually, do you hear that keyboard?" Because Jerry was doing an organ solo. "You know that guy?" And he's like, "Who is it?" I said, "Jerry." And then he kind of put it together. But he thought it was a current band that was just on the radio, as something that was happening now. So, yes, you're right. They were very far ahead of the time.
It's amazing when you hear like, Hospital, and there's that organ in the beginning that comes in so low, and it just seems like yeah, that's like something that bands now are still experimenting with, like tones and the use of tone on that record, and just sort of like the way he plays with the lyrics too, and perspective. Like there's just so much stuff on it that it's still weirdly underappreciated.
Well, it's their own fault. Let's face it, they split up before they even released an album. So tough luck. I mean, you got to actually stick with the plan if you want to be successful. So, whenever you see an artist and you say, "Oh, they're so underrated," or what, it's usually something that they did. It's not the world conspiring against them.
Where were you hearing about all this stuff? Because once again, this isn't really mainstream music, especially like bands like the Seeds and the Count Five. Like where were you kind of discovering all this stuff?
I guess it was probably Cream magazine,
Mm-hmm.
and some other magazines like that. There was another one called Rock something.
Rock Scene?
Yeah, right. Well, Lisa Robinson I think she was the editor or the main writer for that. And we ended up having an incident with her where we locked her in. Well, we didn't lock her. We sandbagged her into a studio that was next to the studio we were in when we were on a bender, actually. And she was producing a band, and we were so wasted that we got the bright idea to sandbag Lisa into the studio. So she never gave us any more good reviews after that. Don't blame her either. It was entirely our fault.
I was going to ask, was Gulcher fanzine, like, like other stuff from the Midwest, like, was that kind of getting on your radar? Like, stuff that was happening in other parts of the area?
We had our own fanzines, and we made our own fanzine. So we had, in Milwaukee, there were several fanzines. One was called Express, which was actually done by Kevin Kinney, who eventually became Drivin' and Cryin'.
Oh,
that band from Atlanta.
Mm-hmm.
Well, he's from Milwaukee. So we went to high school together, and he had a fanzine. There was another one that was called Autonomy.
Okay.
It wrote about the Milwaukee punk band. So we had our own fanzines. We didn't try to read fanzines from other cities.
What about the Gizmos? Like, did you know about them?
I still don't know about it. What is it?
They were like around like 76, 75, and they put out like a bunch of singles, muff diving across the USA. And once again, like very kind of lo-fi, but definitely, Modern Lovers influenced, television influence, kind of, formative, early foundational kind of punk rock stuff.
I may have lost those brain cells if I ever had them.
I was going to ask you though, where did it kind of go from there for you? Like, what was the first sort of punk band you remember seeing? Actually, what was the first concert you remember going to?
First concert was Yes.
Oh yeah. You're not the first person to say that. It was their first show that went into punk after that. Were you into prog stuff at that time too?
Yeah, well, I was into that initially.
Mm-hmm.
That was the first record I bought was Yes. And I'm glad I did because the bass player, Chris Squire, is still probably my biggest influence. And you can hear that in my playing. So he was such a towering genius of the bass that it's a good place to start. And then right after that, because prog kind of led me indirectly, I guess, into Syd Barrett, and then I got into the Velvet Underground. This all happened in quick succession. Once I found the Velvet Underground, of course, that led to the punk thing as well, because you follow that, and John Cale goes to the Stooges, Nico, and all that other stuff. And Lou Reed himself. I mean, Lou Reed was in the mainstream and when I became kind of age, but he was still at times very close to punk.
Yeah. It's interesting when you like think about him in that era, like where he sat in New York, where he was like, like pretty heavy into drugs at that point and pretty, like even though he was a big star and pretty mainstream, he never left the streets.
Well, he was a real character. We knew him. I actually recorded with the Velvet Underground, which was
wow.
Yeah, it happened because Victor, the drummer from the Femmes, and we were backing up Mo Tucker on one of her solo albums. And then, so we were recording a bunch of stuff. And then she said, "Oh, we're going to have some guests tomorrow." And then the next day there was Lou Reed, John Cale, Sterling Morrison, and then me and Victor. So, I mean, to us, this was much more important than the Beatles reforming.
Mm.
And we were there. We're like, oh, what the fuck? Velvet Underground and us. And she put that out, and almost nobody noticed that the Velvet Underground had reformed. And it was several years before they actually did reform and played at that thing in France that they did.
Mm-hmm.
So that's just one of, it's a good example of how, even though they're almost overrated, they're underrated.
Yeah.
Because when they reformed, her album wouldn't have been having much commercial impetus behind it, but still you'd think somebody would notice. Nobody noticed.
It's almost like people can't appreciate these artists till they're gone. Like there's not like a real cultural understanding, or it doesn't sink in on some level, because like they are, even Lou Reed, it's like, it's weird to think that how like just around he was until he passed away, and now it's almost like he's deified.
Well, I still hear people say, "Oh, he can't sing," and you hear them say that about Bob Dylan as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
people are stupid. So anyway, Lou Reed, to me, and John Cale. John Cale had the misfortune of being in a band with another, incredibly strong figure, but they're both in the top 10 musicians who ever played rock music.
Mm-hmm. So where'd you kind of go from Yes? Like what was the next band that you kind of heard on your journey from there? Like sorry, you've mentioned getting into Floyd and the Velvet Underground, but where'd you kind of go from those bands?
Then shortly after that, punk happened, and then it was like, okay, I was also into early Roxy Music, which I think is also very close to punk.
Mm-hmm.
Like the first 2 or even 3 Roxy Music albums were precursors of that. And then punk happened, so all those bands came out, and it was like I could see that they were almost my age and almost my ability, maybe a little bit more advanced, and then it was like, okay, now I've got a place to go. Because with Yes, it's like you look at them and you hear it and you appreciate it, but it did appear to be beyond my ability to do it myself or even to find other people to do it with. Whereas with punk, you listen to it and it's like, I can do that. And then that's what we did.
Yeah, it's like that's like the ultimate power about the genre is the fact that it does say to kids and young people, like, you can do this. Like, some of the best music in the world is written by people under 30, and here's your permission slip. Go out and make it.
Yeah, it's amazing how, like you just said, under 30, or even the idea that Jimi Hendrix and many other people like Nick Drake and Jim Morrison, people like that died before they were even 30 years old after accomplishing some of the greatest work of the entire century, you know. And now kids, they barely get out of the house before they're 30.
Yeah.
I don't see as much youth. Well, the youth culture doesn't seem to have as much influence on the culture as it did maybe in the earlier days of rock music.
Well, it's interesting too, because like all the tools are so much more accessible now. Like any kid could basically record an album with a phone, you know, in like some sort of like rudimentary capacity. But like you're saying, like I think about my own children and just like I was 12 when I was going out and buying your record for the first time. And I've got a 12-year-old now, and it just doesn't feel like that's the drive in the same way.
Well, they have other interests, and this is normal.
Mm-hmm.
We just didn't think it would ever happen like that because, you know, sometimes I explain this because I'm a curator at a museum in Australia. So I have a staff, and almost all of them are younger than me. You know, so sometimes I just try to explain. When I was your age, there was nothing that you could aspire to that was cooler than to be a rock musician, except maybe if you wanted to be a basketball hero or something. But if you didn't have the skills to play basketball or football or whatever, you knew that rock music was the only coolest thing that you could do.
Yeah.
Whereas now, there are other things, you know, such as being a DJ, writing a graphic novel, developing a video game,
playing a video game. Like my kids love people that just play video games now.
Yeah, they watch videos of people playing video games.
Yeah.
So it's just a different paradigm.
Mm-hmm. No, exactly.
And we want to be nostalgic about rock music, but there are many things about the way that even the music scene is now that's better than it was in some ways than in the past. Like, for example, when I started in rock music, there was an idea, or it was expressed very frequently. Can women play rock music? Like, they knew that they could sing it. Like, they knew that Janis Joplin could sing rock music, but could they play it? You know, and it's like, well, I always thought they could because I liked the Runaways, and you know, there were a few examples of that, but now nobody thinks that way.
Mm-hmm.
So there's been some progress. Or the idea, can Europeans make rock music? It was understood that Americans and the Brits could do it, and maybe even the Australians could, only because they were imitating the Americans and the Brits. You know, but now people understand that it can come from anywhere in the world.
Yeah.
There's been some progress.
I think that happens in punk first too, right? Like that's where you have, you know, like bands from all over the world, you know, trading their music and bands putting out records in different countries, you know, like it felt like there was a tape exchanges happening. And it feels like a lot of this progress was happening kind of in punk first in music.
Yeah, I think so. But even punk was very, like, for example, lately I've been listening a lot to the Slits. And then I realized I always liked the Slits, but the canonical sense of punk was that there was this like pyramid, where at the top was Sex Pistols, Flash. Slits would have been considered like third or fourth, fifth tier, but now I listen to them much more than I would listen to the Clash or the Sex Pistols. But that's because who are the people creating the canon? Men.
Mm-hmm.
And who's writing it? Who's saying this is the only band that matters? So, this kind of stuff. So even with punk, I think that there was still the idea that the Americans and the Brits dominated, or even that New York, Los Angeles, London dominated. Like, we had great bands in Milwaukee, but until the Femmes hit, none of them really were able to attain much prominence because they had no media push behind them and no record companies there. So I think what you're saying is correct, that punk was happening all over the world, but it wasn't an equal playing field. And still, the people who lived in the right place, which was London, New York, and somewhat LA, they had the advantage.
Yeah. Oh, I think definitely because of media access. If you're in one of those centers, you have access to, like you're saying, record labels, but also just like national radio, national press, like those things are at your fingertips. Like in Toronto, we kind of have the same privilege here too. But you brought up all those great bands. I wanted to ask you about the Haskells. Did you ever play with those guys?
No, but I was a huge fan of theirs, and I probably saw them play about, I don't know, 100 times or something.
Amazing.
And their drummer, Guy Hoffman, ended up playing in the Femmes.
He also played in the Oil Tasters, right?
Yeah, and the Oil Tasters were even better than the Haskells. And their sax player, Caleb, he was our sound man for decades, and he played with the Horns of Dilemma. So he's on some of our recordings. And yeah, they were an absolutely amazing band.
Yeah, that there is so many great singles. Well, I guess the Oil Tasters put out a lot more than just a few singles, but in the case of the Haskells, like there's just so many great singles that come out of that part of the country, part of the United States that you just don't hear about because, they didn't have that access to like, a big international magazine or radio play or things like that.
Yeah, like I would say that the Oil Tasters are equally as good as any of the other bands of that generation.
I found it interesting when you talked about that hierarchy that exists in punk and that pyramid, because that, is something that has been established, but it kind of feels like it's almost getting upset now. Like when you listen to a lot of the newer bands that are coming out, especially in the UK, it's almost arguable that they're more influenced by bands like Gang of Four than they would be by bands like The Clash. Like you're seeing this sort of, and you're saying the Slits, like the Slits, I think have definitely been culturally reassessed now, where people are viewing them as being one of the great bands to kind of come out of punk rock because they were so unique.
Well, it took them a long time, though.
Mm-hmm.
But this is what posterity can do sometimes. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it just erodes things even further.
Well, I wanted to ask you about what was the first lineup that you guys formed with the Violent Femmes when it was just the two-piece? Like, did you guys ever play shows, or what did it sound like?
Well, we had there are different points of origin of Violent Femmes. The name originated, and it was myself and Victor, the drummer,
mm-hmm.
and we called ourselves Violent Femmes no matter who we were playing with. So we're like a rhythm section for hire.
Okay.
Well, not even for hire, because we frequently would do it for free. But anyway, we play with anybody, but we were called Violent Femmes, and they were called Damien or whoever.
Yeah.
And then when we met Gordon, initially it was also called Gordon Gano and the Violent Femmes. But then when we decided to get serious, well, serious means let's form a band rather than let's just play ad hoc house gigs and stuff like that. Let's try to make a record and all this kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, what's the name? What's the name going to be? And of course, we had this discussion. And of course, Gordon had the suggestion, why don't we call it Gordon Gano? And then Victor and I said, well, why don't we call it Violent Femmes? And then Gordon said, well, why don't we call it Gordon Gano and the Violent Femmes? And then Victor and I we talked to each other. That's kind of like Bruce Springsteen and the E Street Band, but now Bruce Springsteen's likely to go solo and leave the E Street. No, how about if we call it Violent Femmes? So we just kind of bullied him into it, and I think he still resents that.
But you had played with him before, just on your own, right? Like there's a story about that.
Yeah, I played with Gordon, especially one really memorable gig at his high school, and that was when Victor was on tour in Europe with a theater company. And then, we had so much fun playing at Gordon's high school, and I said, yeah, there's this great drummer I play with, but he's not here, but when he comes back from Europe, we should get together with him, and that's pretty much how that happened.
And that one show you played, though, he got like expelled from the school, according to the legend.
It's not a legend; it's true.
I get. Well, there's truth to the legend. I get. So it's a true story then. But what was it just because of like the sonic of it, or was it actually just like a crazy show itself?
Well, we did "Give Me the Car." So this song is like, "Come on, girl, give me your cons," and it's like, "We're gonna get high." We're gonna, at that time that was. I mean, that was pre-rap, or rap maybe existed in the underground, but it wasn't everywhere. So that kind of language and those sentiments in a high school was unacceptable at that time. Now it would probably be okay.
Yeah. Where did you kind of start? So you guys, like, once again, this is the famous story is that you guys would practice up by playing on the street, busking, basically.
Yeah.
Did you guys play real shows as well at that time?
We wanted to, but we had difficulty getting gigs, so that's the reason why we would do that on the street. We called it playing on the street. We did not know the word busking.
Okay.
And we did it in England, and everybody said, "Oh, now you're busking," and we're like, "What?" We had never heard the word before, so
we have Busker Fest here, where they it's like an international festival where all different street performers from all over the world come in and perform. So it's like it's such a storied art, but like I guess with you guys it's also just out of necessity more than trying to tap into that art form.
Yeah, first. We have to be considered one of the most successful
definitely
busking stories in history.
Yeah, there's that story that I guess Sid and Johnny would play. They would go on the street and busk, and people would pay them to stop playing. So I think you guys are definitely more successful than they were in that regard. What was the scene like though? Like when you were trying to play shows, was it just because you guys couldn't get into the punk scene to play these shows, or these clubs were just not accepting new bands, or?
Well, they just thought we sucked. And then furthermore, we were playing acoustic instruments. So they said, you're not rock musicians, you're folk musicians. And then I would say something like, have you ever heard Elvis Presley, the Sun Sessions? Have you ever heard Gene Vincent and the Blue Caps? And they're like, huh? What's that? And so, they didn't understand that what we were doing was really very much like the origins of rock and roll. But they're idiots. They were a bunch of fools from Milwaukee. They thought that like Leonard Skinner and that kind of stuff was what rock music was.
Was there much of an experimental music scene too there at the time?
Well, in retrospect, there was. I mean, there were a lot of people doing it. And every one of those bands had about 10 or 15 fans. And every one of those fans was in another band that had 10 or 15 fans. So it was there were maybe in 1970, let's say 76 through 80 or something like that, maybe there were 1,000 people who were really into this stuff. And of that 1,000, maybe 500 of them were doing it, like they were either in bands, they were avant-garde artists, or they were DJs on a radio station playing the music or writing fanzines or making posters or something. So there were hardly any public that was into it, and almost everybody that was into it was also doing it.
Hmm. Which I guess is different than what we're talking about happening now, where there's a lot more spectators on things than, you're not necessarily encouraged to get involved in the same way with it in a lot of the music scenes now. Well, no, maybe I shouldn't say that a lot, but it feels like there's more of a barrier of entry now to doing things.
Well, the whole professional amateur thing is it's a it's a contrivance. But we just thought we were amateurs because we just didn't think it was possible. We didn't think it was going to be possible to be professionals. Although the Femmes did, quickly become professionals like to the extent where we didn't have to work other jobs. We were making enough money to live on as bohemians, and we had everything else we needed in life, like pleasures.
Did you guys had you guys recorded it before that Pretenders show? That first Pretenders show?
I don't think we had recorded our demos yet.
So what was the goal in the band at that point? Because like obviously now like Violent Femmes are, one of the most important bands that kind of come out of this thing. And you shaped music, but like at the time, like you're saying, there's not really a playbook for you guys to follow as a band. Like what was the hope for the band? Like putting out records or touring or
We hoped to put out a record on a label that would get it distributed around the world, or at least around America. And so we made a demo, and you can hear that demo. It's been released as part of the reissue of the first album. And it's most of the same songs. It almost sounds the same as the album.
the Rhino one, right? The Rhino double CD thing that came out a couple years, well, I guess a while back now.
Yeah. So there are, I think, Blister in the Sun, Kiss Off, Breaking Up, Waiting for the Bus, and Gone Daddy Gone, I think, on there. Those were the demos that we made that we sent around to record labels, 100 record labels. And the only label that wanted us was Slash.
Wow, that's so weird too, because those songs are all so killer out of the gate. And like you're saying, like when you listen to the, obviously it's a little more polished on the album itself, but when you listen to those demos on that reissue, sonically they're not that far off. Like it's just so weird that only Slash could hear it.
And even that took a lot of pressure from, like, the staff were pressuring the brass at the Slash. They didn't want it. They didn't want it either, but the staff were constantly playing it until finally they said, okay, if we sign this band, will you stop playing this shit in the office? So, yeah.
Had you guys gone out and played there? Had they seen you live yet?
No. We played in New York, and we got a big review in the New York Times. As we supported Richard Hell on his comeback gigs. And of course, we blew him off the stage. And that's basically what the New York Times said.
Yeah. So it was based on, like, even it's so wild to think that even on the strength of that review, that and those songs, that it wouldn't be something more than just Slash hearing it, but like I guess we're talking about, there's not really an act that kind of you guys are following in the path of, like, you guys are definitely creating your own world, and still, like, there's no band that sounds like the Violent Femmes.
Well, the only other one that sounds like us predates us, and that's the Modern Lovers.
Yeah. I guess, what, I never really appreciated the influence on it, but I can definitely hear that now.
Especially Jonathan's later stuff when he was acoustic. But Gordon didn't know about that. I did. And Gordon opened up for Jonathan, but Gordon had not ever heard Jonathan. And then Jonathan told him, like, hey, you sound kind of like how I sounded when I was your age.
That's awesome. Well, I could talk to you forever, and I don't want to keep you all night, but there's a couple questions I've been dying to ask you forever. First of all, why did Rocks only come out in Australia?
Well, we were doing a tour in Australia, and I guess whatever the previous album was, which was probably Why Do Birds Sing, I
Hmm.
guess.
Hmm.
Yeah, we already had tour in Australia for that album. So we had nothing new in the market. And the record company just asked us if we put together an EP. But of course, we allocated about a week to make an EP, and instead, like in 3 days, we made a whole album. So we released that only in Australia because we had a tour coming up there, and then we didn't think about it much. And then eventually it did get released in the States.
I think there's like four of my favorite songs that you guys do on that record. Like I think that thing is so underrated. And I remember having to get it as a kid because it wasn't released in Canada. I had to buy a CD and trade it from the CD store because for some reason it was a promo and they couldn't sell it to me or something. It was a lot of ordeal to get it, but it was worth it. Like and Sweet World of Angels is only out now as a live version. I don't think that's out on streaming services or out in sort of the larger
Oh, really?
internet world
So
now.
that album is not on the streaming services.
To the best of my knowledge, every time I look for it, because there is a live version of Sweet World of Angels, but I think that's like one of the all-time best songs. And yeah, I think the only that live version's out there.
I'll have to check that out. Maybe
Um,
we need to reissue it again.
yeah, I would definitely. I would love to get that on vinyl. Uh, I also wanted to ask you about like were bands like DOA and Black Flag and those types of bands coming through Milwaukee? Like who were some of the touring acts that would come through?
Yeah, those bands and Bad Brains, Minutemen. Yeah, a lot of those bands, which were kind of associated with hardcore
Hmm.
punk, they all came through. I did posters for them. Like I did a poster for TSOL once, and I can't remember, but yeah, there were a lot of bands.
I got to see these posters. That's that.
Flipper, yeah.
That sounds amazing. You got to put out a poster book of just all your old punk flyers at some point. Well, Brian, anytime you want to come back on here and talk about punk rock or hardcore, please know the door is always open. And once again, thank you for years of incredible music.
Also with the hardcore, there were a few good bands in Milwaukee, like Sacred Order, Die Kreuzen, and then Tar Babies were from Madison. We knew all of them, and we were they thought of us as kind of commercial or something, but we liked them.
Oh, well, what about Mech Mensch? Were they from
Yep,
Milwaukee?
yep, they were. And
They're,
FI, you know them?
yeah,
Yeah. So there
yeah.
were, and that was just one part of the music scene in Milwaukee. There were a lot of different factions.
Well, I think that's the thing about the Midwest is it's like I'm a record nerd, as you can see. I'm kind of surrounded by 45s and it's like it's a treasure trove. Like it's like panning for gold because there's just so many great garage rock bands. It's like the second garage rock boom. Like we were talking about the Count Five and the Seeds. This is sort of the next great American garage rock boom was this period we're talking about where you have all these people finally given permission to make music, taking it in completely different places.
And then, of course, there was also um, Old Skull.
Yes, a
Well,
tragic band.
yeah, at the time, well, of course, at the time we thought it was so cool and fun and cute, but then it turned out to be, yeah, I mean, it's hard to say. It's difficult to really understand that whole story, whether they would have been better off never having made music,
Hmm.
whether that's what led to their demise. And then there was another dude that was in the scene, but completely sui generis, which was Wesley Willis.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is all circulating around the same time.
What an amazing period. Like what a incredible thing for creativity of all these different people kind of like doing this at the same time period because like you're saying, like with maybe the exception of Old Skull where there is such a tragedy to it, like just so many artists that were, got out in the world that might not have gotten out in the world otherwise, especially in the case of Wesley Willis. Like there's a good chance without sort of this platform, he might not have been heard otherwise.
Yep, it was a really healthy time for creativity, and at the time we just thought it was normal, but it's interesting to look back on it and see it for what it was.
Was there resentment towards you guys because you guys found so much success and like went to LA and kind of like did it a different way?
Yeah, I remember there was one of the bands was kind of following me on the street. I can't remember who it was. Might have been Sacred Order, or but anyway, one of the hardcore punk bands from Milwaukee were following me and saying stuff like "sell out," and I was just thinking to myself, because at that time, yes, we had signed a recording contract. Our advance was $0.
Yeah.
I was homeless. I was like couch surfing, but I was still a sellout.
Success, that's the ultimate sellout. You can't ever get people liking your band or then you sell out.
Right.
Brian, anytime, you're welcome on this show. Thank you for this.
All right, take it easy.
Thank you, Brian, for coming on the show. And you heard right there, Brian will be back for part 2 at some point in the near future. Hopefully we get some SST stories. You know, we didn't get a chance to get to the SST stories this time, but maybe next time. Speaking of next time on the show, a completely different place in the punk rock universe, but one that is equally, maybe even somewhat more important to me on a personal level. Coming up on the next episode of the show, from the band Los Crudos, from the band Limp Wrist, from the band Needles, from What the Fuck Fanzine, from Lingua Armada Records, one of, I tell him he's my personal Liam Mackay, Martin Crudo will be here on this show. And if you do not know Martin, you don't know DIY hardcore. This guy is I don't know, a legend. There's no other way to put it. One of the greatest front people of all time. Just listen to the episode. Listen to Crudos. If you've never heard Crudos, listen to Los Crudos. Listen to Limp Wrist. Listen to all these bands. But oh my gosh, I'm so psyched for you to hear this episode. This is one of those people that I've wanted to come on for years. Didn't think it was going to happen. And then Tristan reached out to Martine and it all came together. And oh, thank you, Tristan. And thank you for listening. That's the end of this episode. Coming up in a few short days, I'll be back to you. But that is that. Remember, as always, Black Lives Matter. The lives of Indigenous peoples matter. We need to protect trans kids, and we need to help trans people protect themselves and stop hate and violence towards Asian people and people of different faiths. And just, we need to realize that the stuff we're talking about here, like people's rights to just live their lives, aren't political issues. These are just issues of human rights. So this isn't political stuff. This is just basic human rights stuff. Someone choosing what they want to do with their reproductive rights, that's not a political issue to me. That's a human rights issue. They should have the right to choose that, you know? So go out there, get involved. There's organizations that are working to political pressure. There's protests. There's all sorts of places that you can lend your support to helping shape the world into a world that you want to see. That's what it comes down to. Like, what kind of world do you want to be in? And do you want, maybe your kids, maybe not your kids. Do you want other generations to live in? Sign your organ donor cards, because by the time they come looking for those organs, you don't need them. You don't. So, give it to someone else. Maybe they can live a long, happy life. I've seen what it can do for people getting an organ transplant. So, yeah, sign that card. Go there and make your own culture. Anyone can do this shit. Starting a podcast, that is the easiest thing in the world. Start a band. Look at Brian. Look at the Violent Femmes. They were hated in Milwaukee, and they changed the course of music forever. MXPX, like Mike Herrera's talking about it. Like, me. Like, there's so many people that have been impacted by this band. It's just you just never know where it's going to go. But you don't have to start a band. You could also start a record label, start a pod. I said start a podcast. You do something. Just put yourself out there creatively. Draw a picture. Try meditating. I didn't think it would work, and it kind of works for me. So maybe it'll work for you. Who knows? But you're no worse off having tried it. It's like 10 minutes out of your life at most. And I know the first time sucks. Probably take a few times before it clicks in. But when it does click in, it can really help. So maybe it's worth a shot. And I think that's it. Thank you, everyone, for listening. And I will see you or speak to you on the next episode.